Welcome to session 196 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 15th of July. Today we'll be looking at Ezekiel 40 to 44 and Psalm 41. But so far in Ezekiel, we've read through Ezekiel's commissioning, his prophetic acts, we've finished the accusations against Judah and the nations, and started the section on the future hope. The book started 5 years after the first group of Israelites had been exiled into Babylon. Jerusalem was still standing and many Israelites still lived there. Ezekiel received a vision of God on his chariot throne over Babylon. God charged Ezekiel with speaking to the Israelites still in Jerusalem to repent and change their ways before it was too late. Ezekiel started acting out prophetic declarations. These included making a miniature model of Jerusalem and acting out sieges against it, laying on his side while eating unclean food, and shaving his head and beard. Ezekiel had a vision of the presence of God leaving the temple and entering his throne chariot carried by the 4 living beings. So God declared judgment over the people, their leaders and their prophets. God used many metaphors to depict Israel: an unfaithful bride, a proud lion now caged, a great vine that was dug up and left in the wilderness. The language was often highly graphic and was intended to be shocking. Then the siege of Jerusalem started. God's wrath was being poured out, and Ezekiel's mouth was free, so he can now move from declaring judgment on Israel to judgment on the foreign nations. We read through judgments on Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. We then started the judgment of Tyre, a city-nation focused on trade, which was much longer than any of the others. God rebuked Tyre's king for trying to set himself above God, which doubled as a rebuke for the spiritual beings who tried to do the same. Then we read the judgment on Egypt. In the same way, the rebuke against Pharaoh was also a rebuke against chaos itself. Finally, Jerusalem was sacked and destroyed, freeing Ezekiel up to focus on prophesying about the future hope. This started with contrasts. The old leaders of Israel, their shepherds, were wicked and fed themselves while leading the people astray. God will set over his people a new shepherd who will lead them well. The foreign nations greedily looked at Israel's land, but God will punish the foreign nations and restore the land to his people. Previously, the people dishonoured God's name with their wickedness, but going forward, God will give them new hearts that want to live right for him. We read through a recreation motif as Ezekiel sees a valley of dry bones come back to life. In the same way, God will bring back to life the land and the people that he decreated. Then came judgment on a man named Gog, who was used as the embodiment of chaos and evil. One day, God will destroy all chaos and evil so that his people can flourish. Let's jump in with today's reading, Ezekiel 40 to 44. When Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem, they also destroyed the temple. This was the place the people were used to worshipping God. If the people are going to return and live in God's presence, they're going to need a new temple to worship in. God once again comes to Ezekiel and gives him a vision of this new temple. They start outside the temple and take a moment to measure the impressive walls. Inside these walls are 3 large gates, one on the south side, one on the east side, and one on the north side. As they went through the east gate into the outer court, they saw 30 rooms built attached to the walls, 10 for each of the southern, eastern, and northern walls. Next, they measured the north and south gate, each exactly like the east gate. Then they moved to the inner court, measuring the gates into this section as well. Inside the inner court was a room to prepare for the sacrifices, places to wash your hands, sacrificing the animals and hanging up the meat. Also in the inner court were 2 dorm rooms. The one to the south was for the priests who were responsible for the temple, and the one to the north was for the priests who were responsible for the altar. Ezekiel makes his way up the stairs to the temple itself. Inside the temple, he measures all the dimensions and then enters the inner temple to measure in there. This space is the most holy place. This is where God's presence dwells. Ezekiel then begins to move back out from the most holy place. Moving back into the outer section of the temple, he notices 90 rooms built into the walls spread across 3 floors. He begins measuring in greater detail and notices some of the finer details. There are cherubim and trees carved into the walls. Next, he moved back out into the inner court and explores the dorms for the priests. They too were built with 3 floors. These were the buildings where the priests could enjoy the portion of an offerings which they were allowed to eat. Ezekiel then moved back to the outer court and makes some more measurements. Then, in his vision, Ezekiel sees God approaching from the east and entering his new temple, filling it with his glory. In Ezekiel 10, we saw God leave the old temple because of the wickedness of his people. Now he is returning. God calls out to Ezekiel to tell him that his new temple is going to be his dwelling place. The people are to no longer commit their wickedness, but they are to be pure. God punished them for their wickedness before, but now he will remain with them if they remain pure. God encourages Ezekiel to make a note of all the descriptions and dimensions of the temple. If the people ever despair because they think they've chased God away forever, he is to let them know that God has given them a plan for a future temple and he will one day be with them again. God then teaches Ezekiel how to restore proper worship to the temple. We got a description of the altar and how to use it. It may seem strange to us that in this future temple, God is going to restore animal sacrifice. Looking forward to the New Testament, as believers, we don't need to deal with sacrifices anymore. That's been paid for by Jesus. The importance here isn't the actual sacrifices. That's just God using imagery that makes sense to Ezekiel. The important part is that God is going to restore proper worship to his house. Ezekiel is then taken back to the eastern gate to the outer courts. This was the main gate. God tells Ezekiel this gate will be locked until the future prince comes and eats bread in this gateway. Finally, we get a description of who is and isn't allowed in the temple. Those who are uncircumcised in heart and in flesh, that haven't made the commitment to be faithful to God, will not be allowed in. Similarly, unfaithful priests, those that made the commitment but then turned away from God, they would be allowed in but would not have access the same as they did before. Then comes a long description of how the godly priest should behave. Once again, the point of this is not the restoration of the strict priesthood and all the rules that came with it. The focus is that the people of God who come close to him will once again be made right and holy in his presence. But that is Ezekiel 40 to 44. Now let's look at Psalm 41. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm. It has all the features we have come to expect from a lament psalm: complaint, a request for God to intervene, and a declaration of trust. Psalm 41 is also significant because it's the last psalm of the first book of Psalms. The large collection of psalms is broken down into 5 smaller books. It's not clear why the divisions between each book is made. Some argue it is to reflect the Torah that also has 5 books. Either way, we can tell where one book ends and another begins by the doxologies that end each section. A doxology is a liturgical hymn or declaration of praise that is used to end a service, prayer, or passage. The structure of Psalm 41 is a chiasm where the passage reflects itself. Here's a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verses 1 to 3, a declaration of trust in God. Verse 4, a prayer for mercy and healing. Verses 5 to 9, lament over suffering. Verse 10, a prayer for mercy and healing. Verses 11 to 12, a declaration of trust in God. And then finally, verse 13, concluding doxology to the first book of the Psalms. The Psalms opens with a declaration of trust in God. The Lord protects those who care for the poor. He keeps them alive, protects them from their enemies, and heals their illnesses. This declaration of trust then leads the psalmist to bring their requests to God. Have mercy on me and heal me. We can gather from the psalm that the psalmist is inflicted with some sort of illness due to the number of references to health. The psalmist then moves forward to bring their complaint, their suffering that they have faced due to their illness. In this example, the worst thing isn't the illness itself, but how much the psalmist's enemies are enjoying this illness. While the psalmist is there, presumably wasting away, their enemies are rejoicing and telling everyone about it. They are waiting for the psalmist to die, and even the psalmist's friends have turned on them. Having shared their complaint with God, the psalmist once again asks God to intervene. Have mercy on me and raise me up. And the psalmist returns once more to a declaration of trust. The psalmist knows that God will delight in them and not their enemies. God will be the one to protect them. Finally, this psalm and the first book of the wider collection ends with a blessing to the Lord. In this psalm, we can easily see the different stages of biblical lament and how each one is important to processing difficult situations and emotions. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.